New York's power looks inevitable now, but its rise was anything but certain. 3 centuries ago, it was just another colonial trading post on the edge of Lenape land, until its deep harbor, engineered street grid, and one audacious canal gamble rewired the continent's economy. Why did this patch of riverbank, and not Boston or Philadelphia, become the world's city? The answer lies in a series of ruthless decisions and strokes of luck that shaped the competition for global dominance, and the consequences still reverberate today. Centuries before the city's towers and tunnels, the land at the mouth of the Hudson River was already a crossroads. The Lenape people fished these waters, paddled canoes through tidal creeks, and traded along networks that stretched deep into the continent. Their seasonal camps and portage paths mapped out the region's first logistics grid, long before any European charted the coastline. In 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano's ship entered the vast estuary, noting islands, deep channels, and a harbor sheltered from Atlantic storms. The water here ran deep enough for ocean-going vessels to anchor close to shore, an asset rare among North American ports. Nearly a century later, in 1609, Henry Hudson sailed upriver on behalf of the Dutch East India Company, finding a tidal river that carried ships far inland, linking the Atlantic directly to the continent's interior. By the early 1620s, Dutch traders backed by the Dutch West India Company saw what geography offered, a natural funnel for furs, timber, and goods moving between Europe and the vast forested heartland. In 1624 and 1625, they planted a permanent trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan, building Fort Amsterdam to command both river and harbor. The site was not chosen for beauty or comfort. It was a calculation, a deep, ice-free anchorage, with the Hudson as a ready-made highway stretching north, and a short overland portage to the Mohawk and beyond. This patch of rocky ground, bought by Peter Minuit in 1626 for trade goods worth 60 guilders, became the nucleus of New Amsterdam. The deal itself, so often mythologized, reflected a collision of worldviews, the Dutch seeking clear title, the Lenape seeing land as shared, not sold. Yet from the start, New York's destiny was not just in its soil, but in its water. Every ship that entered the harbor, every canoe that slipped through the reeds, reinforced the logic that this place was a gateway, one shaped as much by indigenous roots and river currents as by colonial ambition. In 1811, a trio of appointed commissioners, Gouverneur Morris, Simeon DeWitt, and John Rutherford, unfurled a plan that would permanently alter Manhattan's fate. Their blueprint ignored the island's hills, streams, and many existing roads. Instead, it imposed a strict grid. It laid out 12 avenues running north to south and 155 streets running east to west, stretching from Houston Street to 155th Street. Each block measured roughly 200 feet by 600 feet. This was more than urban design. It was a system for turning land into units that could be easily measured, divided, and sold. It was about scale and liquidity, making land as tradable as any commodity. Auction records from the years after 1811 show land values spiking near the newly mapped avenues. Surveyors hammered stakes into farmland, marking out rectangles that would become the city's currency. The plan did not wait for population or demand. It mapped out a speculative future, inviting investors to buy and sell pieces of Manhattan long before buildings or people filled the space. The commissioner's vision was not about beauty or community. It was about scale and liquidity. By standardizing the parcels, the grid turned Manhattan into a real estate market machine. Land could be bought, flipped, and leveraged with an ease unknown in older, more organic cities. The consequences were immediate. Property speculation boomed, and the city's framework was set for explosive, profit-driven growth. The grid's logic made Manhattan a blank canvas for capital, and in doing so, it set the terms for how power, wealth, and people would flow through New York for generations. In 1817, New York State gambled on an idea that most of the country saw as folly. A man-made waterway, more than 300 miles long, cut through forests, swamps, and limestone ridges, connecting the Hudson River at Albany to Lake Erie at Buffalo. Geography was destiny. At the center of that push stood DeWitt Clinton, mayor, then governor, a man with a vision grand enough to risk his political future and state finances on what critics called Clinton's ditch. Washington refused to fund it. Jefferson dismissed the canal as madness, so the state turned to its own resources, floating millions in bonds and promising repayment through canal tolls and the rising value of land along the route. Bonds became the bet. Every mile of earth moved was a political bargain. Upstate legislators fought for feeder canals and lock sites that would enrich their towns, while New York City's merchants pushed for the most direct link to the Hudson, desperate to pull the trade of the West away from Philadelphia and Baltimore. Merchants pushed, and politics followed. Construction began on July 4, 1817, in Rome, New York. Over the next 8 years, crews of laborers, many of them recent immigrants, dug, blasted, and built their way across the state. By the time the canal opened in October 1825, it stretched 363 miles and climbed more than 500 feet using 77 locks. The opening parade was a spectacle. Clinton himself rode a packet boat from Buffalo to New York Harbor, where he poured Lake Erie water into the Atlantic in a symbolic wedding of the waters. The results were immediate and staggering. The cost to ship a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City plunged from around $100 to less than $10, a 90% drop. Western wheat, timber, and furs bypassed old routes, flowing straight through Manhattan's warehouses and docks. Within 15 years, canal tolls had paid off the state's debt and were generating surpluses. New York's port eclipsed all rivals, handling more than half the nation's imports by the 1830s. The city's population and property values soared. What looked like a mad gamble became the most lucrative public investment in American history. Not a miracle, but a calculation. Subscribe to Cityfall for more stories about how cities rise, dominate, and reshape the world. On May 17, 1792, 24 brokers gathered beneath a buttonwood tree on Wall Street and signed a pact that would shape American finance. The Buttonwood Agreement, just 2 sentences long, bound them to trade only with each other and to set fixed commissions. This simple contract created a private marketplace built on trust and exclusivity, where deals were made face-to-face and membership was tightly controlled. Over the next decades, the group expanded, moved indoors, and formalized their rules. By 1817, they had a permanent headquarters and a new name, the New York Stock and Exchange Board, soon known as the New York Stock Exchange. Early trading focused on government bonds and bank shares, but as New York's port and canal networks grew, so did the scale and ambition of its financial markets. Manhattan brokers began to outpace their Philadelphia rivals, handling marine insurance, bills of exchange, and the first corporate securities. By the early 20th century, New York's financial system was the country's nerve center, linking distant railroads and factories to investors around the world. But this network was fragile, relying on private trust and informal agreements. In October 1907, that system faced a severe test. A failed attempt to corner United Copper stock set off a chain reaction. Panic spread as rumors circulated, and depositors rushed to withdraw funds from major trust companies. The Knickerbocker Trust, one of the largest, shut its doors after losing millions in a single day. The crisis quickly threatened the stability of banks, trusts, and the New York Stock Exchange itself. J.P. Morgan emerged as the system's crisis manager. From his library at 23 Wall Street, Morgan called together the city's top bankers and trust company presidents, refusing to let them leave until they agreed to pool resources and rescue endangered institutions. Accountants worked through the night to audit the Trust Company of America, while Morgan and his allies assembled emergency loans, sometimes totaling $23 million in a matter of hours, to keep the stock exchange afloat. The U.S. Treasury injected federal funds into New York banks, but no government agency could coordinate the response. For 2 tense weeks, Morgan decided which firms would survive and which would fail. When the panic subsided in November, disaster had been averted, but the episode revealed the limits of private rescue. If you want more stories about how cities rise, dominate, and reshape the world, subscribe to Cityfall. Subscribe to Cityfall for more episodes about urban power, crisis, and reinvention. The 1907 panic set the stage for reform. By 1914, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York opened, providing an official backstop. The club that began under a tree had become the command center of a national financial system, its reach and its risks now stretching far beyond Wall Street. On an autumn morning in 1929, the New York Stock Exchange opened to a storm of panic. Thursday, October 24th, later called Black Thursday, saw nearly 13 million shares trade hands, triple the volume of a typical day. Bankers scrambled to halt the slide, but their intervention only slowed the inevitable. By Black Tuesday, October 29th, the ticker tape lagged hours behind the selling. 16 million shares moved in a single session, with prices collapsing so fast that there were moments when no buyers could be found at any price. In just over 2 months, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost nearly half its value. Over the next 3 years, 90% of the market's worth would be wiped out. The crash didn't just erase fortunes. It triggered a chain reaction that rippled through banks, factories, and tenements. More than 9,000 banks failed across the country between 1930 and 1933, taking billions in deposits with them. In New York, breadlines stretched for blocks, while the city's role as the epicenter of finance became a double-edged sword. The same networks that had funneled capital and ambition into Manhattan now spread the shockwaves outward, linking the fate of distant communities to the decisions made on Wall Street. In the wreckage, Washington imposed a new order. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, promised savers their money would be safe, even if a bank collapsed. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, began policing the markets, demanding transparency from brokers and corporations. For the first time, federal regulators set the rules for the nation's financial heart. But New York adapted. The city's exchanges didn't just survive, they evolved. In 1971, a new system flickered to life, NASDAQ, the world's first electronic stock market. Instead of shouting orders on a crowded trading floor, dealers now watched glowing screens as prices flashed across computer terminals. On the first day, NASDAQ displayed quotes for around 3,000 over-the-counter stocks, companies too small or too new for the New York Stock Exchange. The market's reach expanded beyond Manhattan's stone facades, but the gravitational pull of New York remained. The city's financial ecosystem grew more complex, more interconnected, and more dependent on innovation. Each crisis and invention drew more power into New York's orbit. Regulators, technologists, and bankers built new layers of oversight and opportunity, making the city not just a marketplace, but the command center for American capital. Out of collapse came consolidation. Out of shock came deeper centralization. The rules changed, but the game still played out in New York. Ships from Naples, Hamburg, Odessa, and Palermo docked at New York Harbor, each carrying hundreds of hopeful faces pressed to the rails. Between 1892 and 1954, Ellis Island processed more than 12 million arrivals. Their names fill the ledgers: Levine, Russo, Schmidt, O'Malley, each line a gamble on a new life. By 1910, 40% of New Yorkers were foreign-born, and 3/4 were either immigrants or their children. The city's population, once counted in tens of thousands, swelled into millions in a single generation. After the inspection halls, most newcomers made their way to the Lower East Side. Here, the streets pulsed with every language of Europe and the Mediterranean. Tenements packed more than 700 people on a single acre. The air between the buildings was thick with the smell of coal smoke, bread, and sweat. Rent took half a family's income, and the rest went to food, fuel, and shoes that wore out too quickly. Jacob Reese, a police reporter with a camera and a sense of outrage, captured flashlit images of children sleeping on fire escapes, families crowded into dark rooms, and mothers hunched over sewing machines long after midnight. His book, How the Other Half Lives, forced the city's elite to confront the world just a few blocks from their own. For many, the only work available was in the garment trade. The industry grew by feeding on the city's endless supply of cheap labor. Manufacturers contracted out to small shops, often just a kitchen or parlor in a tenement, where families stitched piecework for a few cents per finished collar or cuff. A mother, father, and 2 children might together earn $8 a week, half of which went straight to the landlord. Factory ledgers from the era show payrolls dominated by new arrivals, Jewish and Italian names, some barely able to sign their own. The piece rate system meant every hour counted, even for children. Wages were low, hours long, but the work kept families afloat and sometimes allowed a few to save enough to open a pushcart or a tiny storefront. The Lower East Side became an engine for both misery and mobility. It was a world of sweatshops, but also of mutual aid societies, labor unions, and crowded synagogues and churches. The International Ladies' Garment Workers Union, born from these streets, organized tens of thousands, mostly young women, who led strikes for better pay and safer conditions. Diaries and oral histories from the Tenement Museum recount how families pooled every resource, took in boarders, and sent children to night school. Over time, some climbed out, moving uptown, buying a small business, sending a daughter to college. But for every family that rose, another arrived to take their place, filling the same rooms, working the same machines. This relentless churn of people and labor powered New York's rise as the nation's garment capital. By the early 20th century, the city produced more clothing than any other in America. Immigrant hands stitched the uniforms of soldiers, the dresses of debutantes, the ready-made suits that filled department stores across the country. The city's scale, its ability to absorb wave after wave of arrivals and turn them into workers, voters, and eventually entrepreneurs, set it apart from every rival. The port fed the tenements fed the factories, and the factories clothed a continent. Every ship that docked brought not just new faces, but the raw energy that kept the city's engine running. In 1916, New York did something no other American city had attempted. It wrote a zoning law that mapped out the very shape of its future skyline. The new code was a reaction to the shadows cast by early skyscrapers like the Equitable Building, which rose straight up from the sidewalk, blocking light and air for entire blocks. The law required setbacks, stepped recesses, as buildings climbed higher, so that towers would narrow as they rose. Architects and developers studied the city's setback diagrams, each line and each angle dictating how much sunlight would reach the street below. The result was a city of wedding cake silhouettes, with each new tower negotiating the rules for height, bulk, and open space. But these rules were also a tool for sorting people and profit. The zoning code divided the city into zones for business, manufacturing, and residence, drawing invisible lines that would shape land values for generations. Property records from the 1920s show how lots in newly zoned commercial districts soared in price, while blocks labeled for lower density housing lagged behind. The code made it easier for banks and developers to predict returns and harder for working-class neighborhoods to resist the slow squeeze of speculation. By mid-century, the calculus of space and power shifted from the drafting table to the bulldozer. Robert Moses, who never won a citywide election, accumulated more authority than any mayor. He held a web of posts, including Parks Commissioner, Tri-Borough Bridge Authority, and head of the New York City Planning Commission. Each post gave him control over budgets, land, and the power of eminent domain. Moses used these levers to redraw the city in concrete and asphalt. From 1948 to 1963, his crews cut the Cross Bronx Expressway through the heart of working-class neighborhoods. Early engineering studies suggested alternate routes through industrial land, but Moses insisted on the most direct path, straight through East Tremont, a dense residential district. City archives and community board minutes record years of protest. Residents organized meetings, circulated petitions, and pleaded for a compromise. Their efforts were no match for the machinery of public authority. Demolition orders arrived, families were evicted, and entire blocks vanished beneath the new highway. Census records from the era count 60,000 people displaced by Moses-era projects citywide. The Cross Bronx alone forced out thousands, scattering communities that had taken decades to build. Moses justified his decisions with the language of progress and efficiency. He argued that highways would relieve congestion, speed suburban commuters, and modernize the city's infrastructure. In practice, the expressway fractured the Bronx, fueling a cycle of disinvestment, white flight, and rising asthma rates along the corridor. The logic of the 1916 zoning code, rationalizing growth and channeling capital, now met the force of the bulldozer, clearing space for cars and commerce, but at a steep human cost. Each blueprint and each route was a choice about who belonged and who could be moved. The city's rise was not just a story of towers and bridges, but of rules written and rewritten to serve those with the power to shape the map. The legacy of these decisions, visible in the jagged lines of highways and the shadowed canyons of glass, would define the city's inequalities for decades to come. In 1896, Adolph Oakes, a publisher from Tennessee, acquired the New York Times for $75,000 at a moment when the city's press was crowded with partisan headlines and sensational stories. Oakes steered the paper toward national influence, insisting on sober reporting and the now familiar motto, "All the news that's fit to print." Within a decade, the Times became the record keeper for American politics and business, and its reach extended far beyond the city. Other publishers and editors followed, and soon, newspapers, magazines, and book publishers clustered in Manhattan, giving New York an outsized role in shaping public opinion. The 20th century brought a new kind of megaphone. Radio networks, NBC and CBS, built their headquarters in Midtown, transmitting news and entertainment from studios on 6th Avenue and Broadway. Millions tuned in each night, hearing the world filtered through a New York lens. Later, television networks joined the mix, and the city's influence stretched across continents. The city's publishing houses, advertising agencies, and broadcasters did not just report the news, they set the tone for national debates, elections, and even popular culture. Subscribe to Cityfall for more stories about how cities rise, dominate, and reshape the world. After the Second World War, New York's gravitational pull reached the diplomatic sphere. In 1945, as world leaders debated where to anchor the new United Nations, the city offered land along the East River, 21 acres purchased with a gift from John D. Rockefeller Jr. The United Nations complex rose on that site, its glass towers reflecting the city's skyline. Delegates from nearly every nation gathered here, making New York a crossroads for global diplomacy. The city now concentrated not only money and media, but also the machinery of international negotiation. In the span of 50 years, New York became the world capital of news, culture, and diplomacy, amplifying its power far beyond its borders. In the spring of 1975, New York City's finances snapped tight. Banks refused to roll over short-term notes. Payrolls for teachers, firefighters, and sanitation workers hung in the balance. The city, once flush with Wall Street's riches, now faced the real threat of default, an unheard-of event for a metropolis of this scale. Behind closed doors, bankers and city officials pored over ledgers and legal opinions, searching for a way out as the city's cash reserves dwindled to days. The state legislature scrambled to assemble a rescue, but the terms would not be set by City Hall. Instead, control shifted to a new entity, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, known as MAC, chaired by investment banker Felix Rohatyn. He was not an elected official, but in the crisis his word carried more weight than the mayor's. Rohatyn's team, representing the city's major banks, demanded strict oversight of every dollar spent. In October, as the city teetered, negotiations stretched through a sleepless 48-hour marathon. Internal memos from the period record the stakes. Federal officials, wary of setting a precedent, refused to guarantee New York's debts without ironclad promises of fiscal discipline. The president at the time, Gerald Ford, made his stance plain, and the Daily News ran the headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." The message was clear: no blank check, no bailout without painful reforms. Under the watch of MAC, city budgets were slashed, wages frozen, and public services cut. Labor unions were pressured to invest their pension funds in city bonds just to keep the lights on. The deal preserved New York's credit, but at a price. The city's autonomy gave way to the priorities of bondholders and bankers. Austerity became the new normal, and the balance of power shifted permanently toward Wall Street. Rohatyn's signature on the MAC documents locked in a governance model that put financial discipline above local politics, a model that would echo through every future crisis. On the morning of September 11, 2001, Lower Manhattan's skyline was torn open. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost, and the city's financial core was reduced to a smoldering void. In the weeks that followed, fear gripped the city, not just of another attack, but of an exodus. Corporate leaders debated whether Wall Street could ever recover. Offices relocated temporarily, and some predicted that New York's dominance in global finance and media had ended for good. But the city's response was swift and calculated. Under Mayor Rudy Giuliani, the immediate focus was on emergency response and public reassurance, keeping markets open, restoring basic services, and projecting stability to the world. As the dust settled, the task shifted to rebuilding. Michael Bloomberg, who took office in January 2002, championed a vision that relied on public-private incentives to keep the city's economic heart beating. Federal and state governments stepped in with the Liberty Bond program, authorizing billions in tax-exempt financing to lure businesses and developers back downtown. These bonds underwrote new office towers, residential conversions, and infrastructure repairs, making it possible for firms like Goldman Sachs and major media companies to recommit to Lower Manhattan. The process was anything but smooth. Competing visions for the World Trade Center site sparked years of dispute. Architect Daniel Libeskind's original master plan, chosen in 2003, was soon entangled in negotiations with leaseholder Larry Silverstein and the Port Authority. Families of victims of September 11, 2001, city officials, and commercial interests clashed over how much space should be devoted to memorials versus rentable office space. Every design tweak became a battle over memory, safety, and profit. Yet, through compromise, a new complex emerged, anchored by One World Trade Center and a memorial plaza, signaling both resilience and the city's ongoing dependence on finance, real estate, and media. The incentives that rebuilt Ground Zero also reinforced New York's core strengths, but they set the stage for questions about the costs and fragility of this model. In April 1956, a converted oil tanker called the Ideal X left Port Newark loaded with 58 steel containers. That quiet departure set off a chain reaction that would sever New York's ancient bond with its own waterfront. The old finger piers of Manhattan and Brooklyn, once packed with crates, barrels, and armies of longshoremen, could not compete with the speed and efficiency of container cranes. Cargo that used to take days to unload by hand now moved in hours with a fraction of the labor. Port planners at the Port Authority saw the future in steel boxes, not burlap sacks. They invested heavily across the river, opening Port Elizabeth Marine Terminal in 1962 as the world's first purpose-built container port. Land was cheap, rail lines ran straight to the docks, and trucks could roll directly onto the highways. The decision was not just about technology, it was about land, logistics, and profit. Manhattan's cramped waterfront, hemmed in by city streets and old tenements, could not be remade for the new system without gutting entire neighborhoods. New Jersey's flat, open ground offered a blank slate. As container traffic surged through Port Newark and Elizabeth, the jobs followed. By the late 1960s, most of the region's cargo moved through New Jersey, leaving Manhattan and Brooklyn's piers to rust. For longshoremen and dockside businesses, it was a sudden and permanent loss. For city planners and developers, the now vacant waterfront became a canvas for a new kind of city, one built around offices, parks, and luxury housing, not cargo and labor. The shift from break bulk to container was not just an upgrade in shipping. It was a calculated move that rewrote the city's relationship with its own land, setting the stage for the inequalities and redevelopment battles that would come next. Inequality in New York is not a footnote. It is a defining feature of the city's power. The city's Gini coefficient hovers around 0.57, making it one of the most unequal large cities in the United States. Income data reveal a stark divide. The top 1% of earners take home more than 40 times the average income of the bottom 99%. For most New Yorkers, the pressure is felt most acutely in the cost of housing. More than half of renter households are officially rent-burdened, spending over 30% of their income just to keep a roof overhead, and a third pay more than half. The numbers are not abstract. In neighborhoods from the South Bronx to Sunset Park, families juggle multiple jobs, double up with relatives, or face the threat of eviction as rents climb faster than wages. The city's housing market is shaped by policy as much as by demand. Since 1971, the 421A tax exemption has given developers hefty property tax breaks to spur new construction. The intent was to boost housing supply, but over time, lobbying by real estate interests helped shift the program's benefits toward luxury towers in Manhattan and waterfront Brooklyn. Renewals in 1984 and the 1990s expanded these incentives, often diluting requirements for affordable units. Investigative reports and budget analyses show billions in public revenue lost, while the supply of deeply affordable housing failed to keep pace with need. Economists and housing advocates warn that such concentrated reliance on global finance and high-end real estate leaves New York exposed to shocks. The city's budget depends heavily on taxes from a small slice of wealthy households and financial sector profits. When markets stumble, funding for schools, transit, and public services can evaporate almost overnight. For many residents, the weight of victory means living on the edge, caught between the promise of opportunity and the reality of precarity. The city that once absorbed risk from across the continent now finds that its own vulnerabilities are built into the very systems that made it rich. New York stands as proof that urban power is constructed, not ordained, a city where each new advantage brings fresh exposure. Today, over 3 million residents live below the poverty line, while billions flow through Wall Street every day. As global shocks accelerate, the city's future hangs in the balance. It is unbeatable only as long as it adapts. Power here is never permanent. It is only borrowed. Share your thoughts below and join us for the next Cityfall story.